strikingly, normally when you get a minister, as you know, in trouble, the cabinet will come along and sit alongside her on the front bench, a show of unity. The only ministers who showed up to support her were Robert Jenrick, who's her deputy, who had to turn up anyway, and the only other minister was Steve Baker, her friend, who's a junior minister at the Northern Ireland office. So pretty flimsy stuff, really.
My thought for the day is that I think Suella Braverman, imperiled politically, though many of us thought that she might be, has ended the day kind of having shored up her reputation, I think, as the darling of the right in the party. And as we just spoke about earlier, this idea that we could be finishing the day with a seriously defiant Home Secretary in the face of multiple ministerial breaches of the ministerial code is quite extraordinary. And I think reflecting on that has been, something.
Yeah. George, your thoughts?
I suppose she proved that attack is sometimes the best form of defence, and I'm sure that will be reflected in some of the front page newspaper headlines tomorrow, won't it? When, you're sitting in the chamber there watching her do that, and this idea of conjuring up the idea of the southern coast of Britain being under attack from migrants, and rather curious bit where she said that immigration is out of control and the policies are shambles. And you think, well, hang on, you've been in charge for the last 12 years.
Yeah.
I thought my other thought for the day, John, was actually how lonely she looks actually in the House of Commons.
Interesting.
So the chamber was pretty deserted, but strikingly, normally when you get a minister, as you know, in trouble, the cabinet will come along and sit alongside her on the front bench, a show of unity. The only ministers who showed up to support her were Robert Jenrick, who's her deputy, who had to turn up anyway, and the only other minister was Steve Baker, her friend, who's a junior minister at the Northern Ireland office. So pretty flimsy stuff, really.
Right, and behind that, George, just push that an inch or two further. What are you picking up that people are actually saying and whispering, not on the floor of the House of Commons, not into microphones like my one, but what are they actually saying when they talk to you about this?
Well, even her supporters, even some of her really close supporters, say that she's walking on extremely thin ice now, and they feel that she's one more blunder away from potentially falling through. I'm going to mix my metaphors here probably, but falling through the ice.
Yeah.
But no, they think that she is in serious trouble. And I suppose the question is, I agree with Lara that she came out fighting, and she'll get some approving headlines tomorrow in some of the right-wing press. The thing is, if you've been at the dispatch box for a long time, you say an awful lot of things which are on the record and can be judged against reality. And there'll be a lot of people going through every single word she said, trying to prove that what she said wasn't quite right.
Yeah.
Including some of her critics on her own side, but also, I suspect, quite a few officials in the Home Office who, let's face it, are not massively enamoured of their new boss.
Well, that's clear. I mean, there's been a torrent of leaks from inside the Home Office, Lara, about such things as the legal advice, which gets back to the point we were making a bit earlier on about the words, the precise words the Home Secretary used when she said she did not block the booking of hotel rooms. I think she's accused of not booking them, not blocking the booking of them. She said she didn't ignore the legal advice. She took account of it. Well, you can take account of legal advice, but not do what the person giving you the advice wants you to do.
Yeah, and I think, talk about the private ones, but even publicly, Sir David Normington, obviously the former permanent secretary in the Home Office, did say that if that advice had been ignored, as it's alleged by multiple sources to have happened, that would constitute a further breach of the ministerial code. So it's very clear that she's on thin ice. And on this political point, I think it's interesting. I was talking to a cabinet minister who definitely doesn't share Suella Braverman's personal politics, I would say, last week about her appointment. I think it's fair to say a number of people were disappointed by this. But they said, actually, if you look at the future of Suella Braverman, if she goes, then we probably will have to have another figure on the right in her place. And actually, they were relatively comfortable with somebody who they think is kind of taking a lot of the flak for what's proving a difficult policy, with a kind of another ally in that kind of wing of the party, somebody like Robert Jenrick, who George says is the deputy, who was sat there behind her. I would say, yes, she had to be there, but I think it was interesting. I don't know if you thought this, George, but it struck me while watching. Usually you have kind of nodding heads, cheers from those behind them in supportive terms. I didn't see any of that from Robert Jenrick this evening. I saw quite a steely-faced gaze. I wouldn't say it was sort of actively disloyal, but there was none of the kind of uproarious cheering that sometimes you get, and I didn't see as much of the nodding as you usually get.
Some sort of signs appearing in some of the reporting on social media about the rise of the party, the European Research Group. We don't always operate as a homogenous body of people. Suggested they are rallying round behind her. It's as if the Home Secretary is appealing above the head of her own side of the House, maybe above many of those MPs who are sitting there silently or not sitting there at all, and saying, "Come and get me if you dare." this is an area where I think I'm on strong territory, whether you like me or whether you like the way that I'm handling it or not. Let me just give you a couple of thoughts of our listeners, just a sample. People are thinking about this and coming down, well, not all of the same opinion. This is from Roger. Thanks, Roger, for this. He says the majority of boat immigrants are not qualified refugees. There's a legal route. They are simply criminals and should be treated as such. So not much sympathy there from Roger. And here's another one from Stephen in Cheltenham. As someone who worked at the Home Office a few years ago, I suspect her advice would have said, well, the better legal view is X, but there are credible legal arguments for why. This stuff isn't black and white, which is what we're kind of saying here. If there is to be a judicial review, and it's suggested that there will be one, or an attempt at one, at any rate, that would be the argument. I didn't ignore the law. I was following the law, but not in the way that some of my critics were suggesting.
Well, I think if there is a judicial review, that's when there's a potential problem, I say, because then you'll get the whole paper trail going through all the decisions that were made. And plainly, there was dissatisfaction with some of the decisions which had been made, or more precisely to your point, John, maybe hadn't been made when Grant Shapps arrived for his brief stint as Home Secretary.
Yes.
How long did that last? About 4 days. The whole load of decisions which are backed up. And I think that will be that's a distinction which I think Suella Braverman will be keen to exploit. The difference between blocking decisions and not taking decisions. Now, if there's a paper trail which suggests she was ignoring legal advice, and the legal advice was that Manston was overcrowded and there should be no more people going into it, then there's a problem, and that could come out in a court case. But I think she did the right thing today in trying to get as much out there as possible. That incredible letter that she wrote earlier on in the day to the Home Affairs Select Committee, in painstaking detail about why she'd broken the ministerial code and the precise sequence of events. I think it's good to actually try and work out what your story is and get it out there, and then of course hope it sticks.
Yeah, I mean, Lara, if George is right, we all saw. I mean, I could see the picture at least of the House of Commons from sitting here. It wasn't a lie with Tory MPs cheering lustily in support of Suella Braverman. Now, if that's the case, and she does not have the kind of support just naturally behind her that she would obviously wish, why appoint her, Lara? I mean, I know the conventional wisdom would be, and it's got something to it, that the Prime Minister wanted to get on the right side of the right wing of his party, but does Suella Braverman have that kind of clout?
Well, there was that slightly cryptic promise to have a government of all the talents when Rishi Sunak came in.
But he got rid of Jacob Rees-Mogg, and he had Steve Baker on side.
This was definitely one of the most eye-catching appointments, yes, but very few in the right of the party could have looked on at Suella Braverman being appointed and claimed that there wasn't a level of political balance in her appointment. I think there's also a sense, like I mentioned with that cabinet minister that I was speaking to, of allowing somebody like Suella Braverman on that wing of the party to own the mistakes at the same time as potentially capitalising on the rhetoric, which does actually sometimes land quite well with voters. I mean, it was interesting this evening. I think there was a kind of notable kind of escalation, in my opinion, on the rhetoric. I mean, just that exchange with Conservative MP Lee Anderson tonight. I don't know if you saw it, when Lee Anderson said if the accommodation isn't good enough for them, they can get on a rubber dinghy back to France, to which Braverman replied, "My friend is right. Any complaints the accommodation isn't good enough is frankly indulgent and ungrateful."
Yeah, no, that is pretty blunt, isn't it? I mean, just saying any complaint about the quality of the accommodation at these centres is ungrateful. Now, it's not disputed that the quality of accommodation at Manston is dreadful.
So dreadful that obviously over the weekend we had multiple sources claiming that Suella Braverman was personally responsible for the outbreak of diseases like diphtheria. So, I mean, really, really serious flaws and shortcomings in the conditions that, a vast number of people now well over capacity are forced to be staying in. You're right.